0.2% of land remains considered Indigenous land. The rest belongs to the Confederacy of Canada. And then also during this period affecting the land, we have the act allowing enfranchisement. And then in 1927, it became illegal for First Nations people to hire lawyers for land claims cases. So, question for you, and this may seem like a silly question. Where are we right now, geographically? Oshawa. Ontario, Durham College. Yeah, getting ahead of me. Whoever said that. Okay, so the land where Durham College stands. So, as I'm sure you've heard in many land acknowledgements over your time here at Durham College, both campuses are located on the traditional territories of the Mississauga, which is a branch of the Anishinaabe Nation, which also includes Algonquins, Chippewa, Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi. The land is covered under the 1923 Williams Treaties, which was a collection of 3 land acquisitions by the Government of Canada. So the total acreage for the acquisition of the Williams Treaty came to 12.9 million acres, or 52.4 thousand kilometers squared, which is larger than the country of Costa Rica, which you can see in blue over in the bottom there. Spanning central and southern Ontario. So in the blown up version of the map, the Williams Treaty covers everything that is in that light blue section.
Yep. Keep going.
So the Williams Treaties began as a post-World War I initiative to extinguish land claims cases by Indigenous people against the Crown. A.S. Williams, a Toronto lawyer at the time, led a commission to investigate the then 70-year-old land claims by the Chippewa and Mississauga nations of the area. To his credit, he determined the claims to be valid and determined that the Crown should settle through adding to the reservation's parcels of land of between 156,000 to 320,000 acres and payments of between 840,000 and 1.37 million, which in today's money would be payments of between $14.7 million and $24.1 million. The Crown itself held a value of the land of over $30 million, which would be $527.6 million today, but we're only going to pay $50,000, which was approximately 0.16% of the actual value of the land. The deal was rushed so that Indigenous peoples would not find out the true value of the land and ask for more. As a result of the rush, unlike previous treaties, the Williams Treaties did not secure hunting and fishing rights for the nations.
Yep.
For the nations involved, which resulted in issues between neighboring treaty lands. And at the time, the signatories included the Mississaugas of Rice Lake, Mud Lake, Scugog Lake, Alderville, and the Chippewas of Christian Island, Georgina Island, and Roema.
Let me just stop for a sec. Oh, yeah, go ahead. Because I want to make sure you have a chance to absorb all of this. Do you want to ask anything at this point, or can we just let her continue? There's a lot of good information. We'll have lots of time to take it up. You okay? Anybody else? Yeah? Keep going. All right?
All right, so now we're going to get into sort of heavier stuff, so I need to remind you of the content warning I gave you before. So, true or false, the Indian Act is still part of Canadian governance. True. Anyone else think differently? No? No, you're right. The most recent amendment to the Act came in August of 2019 and restored status to women and their children who lost it before 1955, or 1951, sorry. The Act and its legacy still have great influence over legislation, and it appears most often in situations concerning status, governance structures, land management, and funding. So, a question for you. What comes to mind when you hear the phrase the Indian Act?
Justice? Control?
Alex, what do you think of when you hear the Indian Act?
Oh, we got to get you the microphone. You're off camera. We got to make sure we hear you. Okay. Here comes a voice from outside. Here we go. Go ahead, Alex. Yeah. Karaoke, okay? That's all.
Well, I essentially think of a deal that was very one-sided and not very. It wasn't made up with teamwork, like the value, like you learn in school about teamwork. This deal was not made with teamwork. It was a very one-sided deal, and that is not very efficient for the greater way of how things work in terms of like indigenous law and of course even Caucasian law.
Good answer. Okay. Alex is a regular in the center. That's why I picked on him. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah.
So, some selections from the Indian Act. To begin, the Act focused on the status First Nations people, excluding non-status Inuit and Métis people, and of course anyone who happened to not be home the day that the government Indian agents came to give people their status. As we mentioned before, in 1876 it became law, followed with the amendment that women gave up their status if they married any non-status person, including if that person was Indigenous. 1884, traditional practices were banned in BC and the residential school system was created. In 1885, we have the pass system implemented to prevent the movement of Indigenous peoples off reserves. This is essentially a passport system. Indigenous people needed to ask the government for permission before leaving reserve lands for any reason. 1895, we have the amendment to the act that banned any Indian festival, dance, or other ceremony. This was added to again in 1914 to outlaw dancing off reserve, and again in 1925 to outlaw dancing entirely. In 1920, we have the law to allow forced enfranchisement, which is basically the government choosing who they could remove status from. This is how a lot of status Indians lost their status. 1927, the legal counsel for land claims becomes illegal. In 1951, we have the new version of the Indian Act, which lifted bans on some ceremonies, and women got the right to vote in band council elections, but did not gain any of their other rights back. And in 1960, we have the beginning of the 60s scoop as residential schools began to close as a replacement program. True or false, number 3. Residential schools provided a valuable and free education to Indigenous children as a demonstration of the church's benevolence.
Well, yeah. Do you want to explain that a little bit? Is true or not true?
It is most definitely false.
But we believed it was true then. This is interesting about history. Had you been back alive then, you probably would have said, that's absolutely true. And so would all of us. But things change, right? Remember evolution in short history of the world? Go on, yeah.
Yeah, so it is emphatically false. The purpose behind residential schools was cultural genocide. In the words of Duncan Campbell Scott, who at the time was the deputy superintendent of the Department of Indian Affairs, I want to get rid of the Indian problem. Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department. The man on the screen is Nicholas Davin. He is considered to have been an architect of the residential school system. In 1879, at the behest of the Canadian government, he went to the United States to study their residential school system. He believed it was much superior to the mission and day school system that Canada had in place at the time, and brought the boarding school system of the United States back to Canada. But he used the existing mission and day school buildings to cut costs for the government. In his report, which he wrote upon returning from the States, he said that Indian culture was a contradiction in terms. Indians were uncivilized, and the aim of education must be to destroy the Indian. If you've ever heard the quote, "Kill the Indian, save the child," I believe that is credited to him as well. He believed that the boarding school system of the Americas did away with what he called the influence of the wigwam, which is basically children going from day school back to their families at night. So the Canadian government operated in partnership with the Anglican, Catholic, Methodist, Mennonite, and Presbyterian churches, but the government was financially responsible for the schools. They operated in all provinces and territories except for PEI, New Brunswick, and Newfoundland, but they were in Newfoundland, except it wasn't considered part of Canada until 1950, so they didn't count those schools. The schools operated from the 1870s to the 1990s. White men, mostly old. That's funny. The last residential school in Canada closed in 1997 in Rankin Inlet, Nunavut. To put that, yeah, to put that in perspective, I was born in 1998. I'm 26 years old. So this didn't even happen 30 years ago. And it is believed that 150,000 Indigenous children attended residential schools. So as we mentioned in our portion on the Indian Act, it was the amendments in 1884 that created and allowed for the residential school system to occur. By 1920, attendance was mandatory for children between 7 and 16 years of age. And in 1933, legal guardianship of the children was transferred to the school principal following the, quote, forcible surrender of the parents, or by the parents, and the enforcers, because you need enforcers for surrender, right? The enforcers behind the so-called surrender were often RCMP officers. So what happened at the schools? I'm not going to read all of this to you. You can read some of it to yourself. Children spent most of their days working in fields or doing domestic labor to support the functioning of the school, as well as to keep costs down for the government. And the classes that they did attend were very low quality. These schools were not run by teachers, they were run by church employees. The most common occurrences at the schools, unfortunately, were abuse, illness, and death. And the following list has been reported by survivors. So we talked about the residential school system. Now we have to talk about the enforcers behind it. So the RCMP was first created by Canada's first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, in 1873 as the Northwest Mounted Police. Their purpose at that time was to stand in for the independent army that Canada, which at the time had only been a country for 6 years, did not have, and to exert colonial control over Indigenous lands and to, quote, clear the way for settlement. They also protected against possible annexation from the Americans in the West, which is a story that is often spun as the Mounties protecting Indigenous peoples from bloodthirsty Americans. In reality, it is the documented first use of paramilitary force for the purposes of westward expansion. The Mounties played a key role in enforcing treaty signing, the Indian Act, reservation boundaries, especially during the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway. The mandate of the RCMP at the time was to convince the red man that the white man governs. In 1885, the RCMP joined the Canadian military, which had been formed in 1883, in a war against the Western Métis, Cinnabon, Cree, and Saulteaux communities. This was known as the Northwest Resistance and was sparked by land rights. Louis Riel, the man on the screen, was the former president of the Métis National Committee, and he was recalled from exile in Montana in 1884 to help negotiate the lands claims case with the government. Following a refusal from the government to negotiate, the Métis prepared a military force. Following 3 battles, Riel was formally charged with treason on July 6, 1885, and he was executed on November 16th of the same year. The site of Riel's execution is actually the current location of the modern RCMP Training Academy. Unfortunately, the RCMP has a legacy of continuing anti-Indigenous action. In 1968, they participated in the illegal arrests of the Mohawks of Akwesasne, who blocked a bridge built through their reserve, which they were not consulted about, which violated the 1794 Jay Treaty. In 1980, they arrested members of the Blood Tribe for a blockade along Highway 5 intended to pressure the government about unresolved land claims. In 1990, there was a 78-day siege against the Mohawks of Kanesatake that involved the RCMP, the Canadian military, and the Sûreté de Québec over a golf course expansion into unceded land. 1995, Ojibwe Act, a golf course. In 1995, an Ojibwe activist was killed by police during the Ipperwash crisis, and the RCMP participated in another 31-day siege of Secwepemc territory. 2013, there were the arrests of more than 40 members of the Elsipogtog First Nation in New Brunswick who are protesting the use of shale gas and fracking on their land, and one that you may be old enough to remember, the 2019 RCMP invasion of the Wet'suwet'en territory and the arresting of their land defenders. So like all police services, the RCMP is sworn to serve and protect. But who are they sworn to serve and protect? The RCMP has been implicated in something called the Starlight Tour, which is considered a Western Canada special. In these tours, officers drive Indigenous people, usually men, to remote locations in sub-zero temperatures and leave them stranded, usually taking clothing or shoes. The cause of death, if their victim does not survive, is written off as hypothermia, and the justification is they must have just gotten drunk and walked off. As we start to experience warmer and warmer summers, there is also the, I guess, creation of a summertime version where people are left in the middle of a remote location at the height of day during extreme temperatures. They have also failed the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit peoples. The Missing Women Commission of Inquiry identified blatant failures on the part of the RCMP that included not taking notes and following up on missing persons reports, not following internal practices and policies, not pursuing all investigative avenues and conducting follow-up work, not treating families with respect and keeping them updated. In 2013, the Human Rights Watch documented numerous reports of violent assaults on Indigenous women and girls by RCMP officers, including rape and sexual assault, both of which have been reported by white RCMP officers as well. A Truth Commission found cases of officers using authority to sexually coerce Inuit women in front of their husbands. And the final report by the Mass Casualty Commission called out the failures and made 130 recommendations. The interim commissioner for the RCMP at the time stated that he didn't have time to read the report. These failures bring us to a movement that has been going around the last few years, the Search the Landfill movement. This is a Canada and now American-wide movement for justice for missing and murdered Indigenous women. It at first concerned the remains of 4 women suspected in the Brady Road and Prairie Green landfills, and I do have updates on the search to come. Jeremy Skibicki was convicted in 2024 of the murders of Mercedes Moran, Morgan Harris, Rebecca Contois, and Ashley Shingoose, who is formerly known as the Buffalo woman Jane Doe. She was actually identified just this past Tuesday on March 25th. Despite him admitting where his victims' remains were, no immediate action was taken. Premier at the time, Heather Stephenson, and the Manitoba Police refused, citing long-term human health and safety concerns, despite having paid for a feasibility study that had already proposed solutions for these concerns, and that similar searches have already taken place in Canada. In Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, 2011, Wesley Hallam, 29, a white man, was killed at a house party and his body was disposed of in the trash. The police at the time searched 3 landfills by hand, including one over the border in Michigan. The search took 3 months and cost $1 million, but his partial remains were recovered. Sean Sparling, who consulted on both the feasibility study and managed the Hallam case, remarked that Winnipeg is dealing with 2 to potentially 3 victims in the same landfill, and the tonnage is greater than the Hallam case. But other than that, the circumstances, the landfill, the process, everything are identical. Time and money are the only different factors. Even Hallam's mother, Sandra, asked how one government could allow a search for her son, but another government could deny a search for others. Unfortunately, the finding of Indigenous women in landfills and in trash has become a bit of a trend. Linda Beardy, 33, was found in the Brady Road landfill along with Rebecca Contois, although no foul play is suspected in her case. Joey English was found in a Calgary landfill. She is suspected to have died of an accidental overdose, and her boyfriend admitted that he was intoxicated at the time and panicked at her death and attempted to hide her body. Tanya Nepanak has been missing with no leads since 2011. She is presumed dead. Before Tuesday, there was hope that she may have been the Jane Doe known as Buffalo Woman. Um, but even when there is just a large scale search, there is hope of an unexpected recovery. For example, during the exhaustive search for Gabby Petito a few years ago, they recovered the remains of 9 missing people, 4 of whom had been murdered. As of the past few weeks, the remains of Morgan Harris and Mercedes Morand have been recovered and conclusively identified, and they are finally coming home. Indigenous women, unfortunately, are 12 times more likely to be murdered or go missing than any other women in Canada. Unfortunately, the perpetrators are often people they know, including intimate partners, family members, and friends. So now we're going to take a breath after all of that, and we're going to talk about some happier things. So an important bit of advice I would give to anyone who teaches about any type of Indigenous history or topics is that when you teach about Indigenous history, remember that highlighting Indigenous joy is just as important as remembering Indigenous suffering. So, another question for you. Have you ever heard of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and what do you know about it? Okay, we've heard of it, but don't know much about it.
Let's see if there's anything. I want you to know that after she's done with the president, we're going to have a very good and difficult conversation. So just be ready that in this classroom today, if you can concentrate fully, and you all are, we're going to have a discussion that I hopefully is really going to help open your mind. But I'm going to be challenging things as a devil's advocate to help you to really understand the tragedy of all of this and the hope that we have for the future. Yeah, go ahead.
So, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, its founding was one of the agreements of the Indian Residential School Settlement to facilitate reconciliation. Their mandate was to inform all Canadians about what happened in residential schools. Between 2007 and 2015, the TRC traveled around Canada and heard from over 6,500 witnesses, hosted 7 national events, and amassed an archive of over 5 million government records, many of which you can access online through their website. In June of 2015, the TRC presented its 6-volume executive summary of its findings, including the 94 calls to action for reconciliation between Canadians and Indigenous peoples, which was accepted by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau at the time. The 94 calls to action included the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, or UNDRIP. This was adopted by General Assembly of the United Nations on September 13th, 2007. Both Canada and the US voted against its adoption at the time. While Canada verbally endorsed UNDRIP in 2007, it did not sign until 2021 and was the last country to do so. UNDRIP states, among other things, affirming that all doctrines, policies, practices based on advocating superiority of peoples or individuals on the basis of national origin or racial, religious, ethnic, or cultural differences are racist, scientifically false, legally invalid, morally condemnable, and socially unjust. Recognizing also the urgent need to respect and promote the rights of Indigenous peoples affirmed in treaties, agreements, and constructive arrangements with states. What document have I mentioned today that this might relate to specifically? The Pope was involved. The scroll things, or the doctrine of discovery. Yeah. So the 94 calls to action are divided into various categories, including those related to children and youth, language and culture, health, justice and the legal system, history and commemoration, and reconciliation. So reconciliation requires something called reconciliation, which is a meaningful action that moves reconciliation forward. They are aimed to bring Indigenous and non-Indigenous people together in the spirit of reconciliation to create awareness, to share, and to learn. The 6 actions include learning about the history between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, understanding the history and legacy of residential schools, exploring the unique intersections we have with treaty, constitutional, Indigenous, and human rights in Canada, recognize the rich contributions Indigenous peoples have made to Canada, take action to present or to address historical injustices and wrongdoings, and to teach others. So simply by being here today, you've covered steps 1 and 2. If you're unsure about how to add a reconciliation plan to your business or your studies, the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation has template plans like the ones you see up on their website. But it can really be as easy as just decolonizing your speech. So if you need to have a quick meeting, don't say, let's have a powwow. Don't refer to your friends as your tribe or your favorite animal as your spirit animal. And correct others if you hear them doing this. So, I mentioned before that I was a dance teacher, and we discussed the laws that outlawed dancing completely. So I thought, well, what better way to represent resurgence and resilience than discussing a couple of the most identifiable dance styles of Indigenous peoples? So we're going to start with the men's fancy.
Okay, I want to make sure the audio is working. Go ahead. Should be okay.
I turned it down on the
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah,
Turn
turn
it
that
up
up
a
and
little
then. Good.
bit. Okay. I'm going to turn it down a little bit. So this was thought to be created around the 1920s and was considered appropriate to perform for visitors or at shows like rodeos. It is loosely based on the war dance, as most men's dance styles are. As you can see, it is flashy, colorful, and highly energetic. It usually requires strength and stamina, and as a result, is often performed by young men and boys. The drum can play a variety of beats, including a war beat, ruffle, crow hop, and a fast beat. It is always expected that a fancy dancer should do a pose at each end of the beat. And the twin feather bustles, so what you see at his shoulders and his hips, are hallmarks of the modern fancy dance regalia.
The tech is working. This means spirit is with us. Good.
Okay. And then we have what could be argued as the women's equivalent. So fancy shawl is considered one of the newest forms of powwow dance. The ladies wear the shawls over their shoulders and dance by jumping and spinning around. The idea is to mimic butterflies in flight. It is very graceful and light. And while specific choreography is not necessarily important, the idea is to have a balanced and symmetrical dance. At least one foot should hit the ground with each drum beat, except during jumps or spins, and the dancer's head also keeps time with the beat. So I said choreography wasn't very important, but some women really have complex footwork in their performances. Okay. So I have, I guess, 2 last questions for you. Have your perceptions about Canada, its formation, and its people changed since the beginning of this presentation? No? Well, you pretty much knew what was going on.
Don't give the answer that you think we want to hear if that's what you're thinking. That's not how you're going to learn. And if you're afraid to say what you really want to say, then don't say it. But this is not a time in this kind of discussion in this room for niceness. It's a time for learning. Okay? Because I'm about to say some things that people are going to be angry about, but I'm going to be the devil's advocate. Just for the sake of discussion, but keep, okay? So nobody want to say anything online? Go ahead.
Or you could answer, did anything in particular stand out to you? And if you don't want to answer that, I also brought little comment cards so you can write what you thought about the presentation if you like. So, anyone want to answer either one of these questions?
The women's fancy dancing was mesmerizing.
Go ahead,
So
Jeff.
we have that the
Oh,
women's
hello.
fancy dancing was mesmerizing. Yes, definitely. It's one of my favorite styles to watch.
Hypnotic, you know?
Hypnotic.
Beautiful, especially the night with the colors and all. It was lovely.
Anything else? It doesn't have to be about the negative parts of the presentation. That's okay. All right. Well, then thank you for your time. If you have any questions, I will bring my placement student, Brooke, up here to help me answer them.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Okay, so can you stay for a little bit, or can she, both of you, or you, whatever? We're going to begin a discussion, and if you have to go, Brooke, do you want to say anything first? Is there anything?
I have some random notes here that I wrote
Go
before
ahead.
I came over.
Absolutely.
So I wanted to share that the foundation of Canada and the borders established during the 1812 War were heavily influenced by the partnerships between the Indigenous peoples and settlers made during the fur trade. The fur trade is what influenced settlers to move inwards in the country and was the establishment of a lot of the relationships between Indigenous peoples on Canadian land and the settlers that came in. The reason that Canada has so many treaties and considerably better relationships with its Indigenous people than the US versus their Indigenous peoples is because it was built on this foundation of an enterprise together. And so the fur trade was originally more beneficial for the Indigenous peoples. In fact, they'd take old furs. They'd be like, "You want my old pants? You're going to pay more for my old pants because it has less of these spiky beaver quills." So, like, this is originally a very profitable thing, and Indigenous people participated and got involved in this economic and social sort of change. So, Indigenous people weren't just victims. We didn't just have these people show up one day and we're like, oh, we knew what was going on. And so, these stages of changes happened over time. It started where we had a great deal of agency. Then we were increasingly dependent on the fur trade, increasingly dependent on European goods. And then suddenly the Europeans had all the control. And so these stages of colonization start by slowly modifying our ways of life, our politics, our economic, our social and spiritual ways. And then they set up external power, external political control, like with the crown. They have people like the mounted police. Then we become financially dependent on them because now we have money. We didn't have that before. Now, instead of trading, we're actually dealing with all these other things. We can't sustain from our land. We're not in our traditional areas. So we're dependent on the colonists. And then we become sort of wards of the state, and we're dependent on them. And they are giving us abysmal social and economic sort of pieces. So this is a gradual transition. We didn't just wake up one day here. This is a really strategic plan that our people were victims of that we can get out of right now, and we're working really hard to get out of. And I also think it's really important that we understand that we're different from the US in the fact that our borders and the relationships that allowed us to defend our border right now was built on those foundational uh, relationships that we had during the fur trade. And so you could say that the fur trade is the reason that we have the borders that we have now, because that is the Indigenous peoples that the British Empire was partnering with to fight. And those relationships existed because of the fur trade. And many of our treaties can only exist in the way that they do because of the fur trade and the relationships created by it.
Because of the beaver. Think about it for a second, okay? In terms of resources, in this country, that beaver has been instrumental. The fur from the beaver, the pelts that were taken, were then taken back to Europe so that the European men who were wealthy could have nice hats. Beaver hats. They were very fashionable. We will see this play out again in the Congo, in the transatlantic slave trade, in the recorded lecture called Humanity Stain. The British again, in the Congo, they want the ivory and the rubber. And what do they want the ivory for? Piano keys, billiard balls. Think about it. Think about the resource that then gets taken and used for a luxury. It's not even a necessity. Okay, are you ready for me to be a devil's advocate? It's only for the sake of understanding, okay? And I don't believe what I'm about to say. Let's go back to the papal bull for a second. Okay, if you've seen the recorded lecture, The Conquest, you may have a sense of where I'm about to go. But let me just say this, be very brief. There is a force in the human story that you've seen, which says they are not human. I'm a Jew. I was not human. But the black, the Indian, the Sikh, all these people who are different should be excluded. But then, what do we do now? Everything's connected. And everybody's going everywhere. Oh, should I say to the guy in the turban, get back to the Punjab and Bill, just keep it there. That's where you belong. And you will just stay dancing. Nice dances. That's what we did. But let me just state the difficult problem here. At that time in history, there were no electronics. There was no real travel. There were ships that took months to cross oceans with. We have instant contact with all parts of the world now. Travel. So what do we do if we're all on the same bus now? This is difficult for humanity. How are we going to resolve all these claims, all these injustices? You don't have to answer this. But if you look at the world around you right now, particularly south of the border, and you look at Russia, and you look at China, and you look at India, these great powers in the world, look at who the rulers are, and look at what they're saying now. Go back. Stay out. Let's go backwards, where it's safe and the men have. What are we going to do? Now, I may be wrong. I'm just presenting you that other view that says, forget about them. It's the white people, the Europeans, the men, the warriors who had the courage to come across the oceans and withstand terrible suffering on those boats, and the religious extremists, the nuns who came from France and helped to build the Catholic New France, who gave up their own children so they could come and be a good Catholic and help others here. Do you think these things are over? Maybe they could return. What are we going to do? What are you going to do? I just want to introduce this
Well,
as...
missionaries never went anywhere. There are still missionaries.
Oh, okay. Well, why don't you tell us about that? Missionaries. They're still there? And what are they doing?
Bringing religion mostly to the interior of Africa.
But how do we go forwards? You are in this world. This is your world, whether you like it or not. It's out there. And whether you come from another part of the world and you're in Canada and you decide you're going to stay here, Push, or you're going to go back there, you're going to have to deal with people who are different. What are you going to do? How are you going to live? Anyways, I just wanted to put that out there, that the force is out there, and don't think it's all in the past. It's present. What else would you like to say or take the discussion? What direction would you like to take it in terms of our future and what we can, as human beings in the human story, take with us going forward from your culture, from this terrible stain in the human story, which is oppression, slavery, ignorance, lack of respect, a sense of superiority? How do we now go? What should we be doing?
Well, I would argue that back when the colonizers did first arrive, they didn't have access to all the information we have now. So, to be fair to them, they believed what the Pope was telling them was true. What the church said was law. They had no way to sort of fact check and be like, well, those people aren't bad just because they're not Christian, right? Like the main, besides the, I guess, the monarchy, people got their information from the church and they had no reason to question it. Now we have education and access to more information than you could ever absorb in your life. So to have sort of bigoted ideals is an active choice now.
For something that we could take for our culture
Okay,
that
yeah.
might help drive change in
choice
the
now.
future. I recently have been doing a lot of PowerPoints and lectures, and something that is almost universal throughout all of the Americas, a principle that is very common among our indigenous peoples in terms of knowing and being, is the idea that everything is constantly changing. We are changing as humans, the seasons are changing, the cycles continue, and we have to adapt to it. And a lot of our ways of teaching indigenous in an indigenous way is through stories or just talking. And this can change the oral words, they change over time because they are adapting to the reality of life that we are living in. And so the principle of all of these stories never wavers. You're always going to be taught to think for yourself, to do the right thing, to make sure that you're helping your community to survive. But while you're doing it, it's just the circumstances you're doing it in. The basic morals of these stories never change despite the stories changing continuously. And I think since the world is changing so much, we could take a lot away from this idea. This idea that we need to constantly change and things are always going to change and we can't cling on to anything because nothing is ever going to be the same as it was even 5 minutes ago. And as long as we take our basic principles, we know what we are and what we want to do and the right way to do them, we can change our actions, we can change with the world, but we can continue being good people.
Community care is also a big part of Indigenous cultures. That's part of why we have the center and we have like the soup lunch every Wednesday, and we have one today as well if you want lunch after this. But it's to care for your community because you're not alone in the world. Like I support Brooke, she supports me. For example, the Micmacs saved Cartier and his crew, and they didn't know who he was, right? And his response was to come and then colonize them. But regardless, they saw people who were suffering and who needed help, and they offered that support in the expectation that that support would come back to them in the future. Reciprocity is a big part of having relationships with Indigenous peoples. So, for example, I did this lecture for the professor here. So, to be reciprocal, he may come do a presentation for us in FPIC someday,
For sure.
or just even just
Absolutely.
sharing updates about his class, asking for collaboration. That sort of working together is key to reconciliation and building relationships that have meaning with Indigenous people.
If you want to bring this into your own self, just to kind of bring it home, try and think about the times when you've really, really suffered in your life and you've had difficulty. Did you get through it all by yourself? All by yourself? Of course, we're responsible for ourselves. And we have an entire global system called global capitalism that is built on that idea that everybody should be allowed to do everything they want because it depends on their own initiative. They make as much money as they want. They should be free because it's all about what you can do. You don't need anybody else. That's what the dark America has become with Donald Trump now. We don't need anybody. We're going to get rich ourselves. The truth is, as Charles Darwin knew, as I showed you, Alfred Russel Wallace knew, and so many others. You always need support at some point. You always need your team. Think about it. Just think about yourself and how you go through your day and how you deal with difficulties. And even those who really, really believe the men, I get strong muscle, I can do it all myself. Oh, yeah? Watch when you're in real crisis. You're going to need somebody. You're going to need something. You are not an island. And I think that this is a really, really, for me, a great lesson of the indigenous cultures is that sense of collective community that we can and we need and we will be better together.
Yeah, I saw some people nodding when he asked if you had gone through the worst times in your life alone, and I get that. I grew up without my culture as well, so I didn't have the community. But the idea is that in a perfect world, if you grew up in your indigenous community and you had a massive struggle, you wouldn't be alone. It wouldn't even be an option. You would, if you had a miscarriage, you would have a bunch of women who would be around you and supporting you through it. Difficult birth, same thing.
Yeah.
If the death in the family, it's a death for the entire community. There's support systems that are just there. You wouldn't even consider going through some sort of crisis by yourself because you would have 85 cousins down the street who never leave your house. Right? So, yeah.
I hope that as you listen or have listened to Rachel, and then Brooke, and if there are any more notes, please feel free to give them, okay? That you're actually thinking about the future. That even though we looked at Canadian history today and we have been talking about the past, and we know we're going through a historical time right now in Canada, but that you will leave here actually thinking about, well, what does this mean for my future? That this is real history that applies to your life. I think people are taking this in. I can see everyone's really there and thinking. Sometimes people will disappear into their machines and devices, but go ahead.
This has affirmed the idea that I've held on to for a while, that to deny yourself of other people and to paint them as monsters fundamentally fractures your own humanity. Um, and it makes your life miserable. If you just look around and say, yeah, the black man, he's my problem. The Chinese, they're my problem. The women, they're my problem. You yourself are responsible for your own perception of people and how you deal with them. And you are the very monster that you see in those people when you get around like that. And I think it's wrong, and I think that is the force that is driving the world and has driven the world since the beginning, really. This idea of global capitalism that you say Adam Smith or whoever espoused, um, I would argue is fundamentally innate to human nature. That I want all the cake. I don't care who starves around me. It isn't right, but it's just how things have been. Um, but I suppose there is an element of truth into being born alone and dying alone and all that. That's what's going to happen to me.
But I'm sensing some pessimism in there. It's like that's the way it's been. That's the way it's always going to be. Maybe you didn't hear what Rachel said. Exactly. We have more information now. We're more educated today. Global literacy rates have risen. You have a choice. The question is, will you access that information? It's right at your fingertips. Or is it just going to be more scrolling through one video after another, the baking, the cooking, the cosmetics, the clothes you're going to wear, all the stuff I see on the bus and the subway. When I look at what people are looking at now, the time wasted. So much time wasted on useless information, scrolling and scrolling. Yes, you need to relax on your machines. I understand we all need to chill out. But then there's a point where it's like, All that information is out there, and you're going to another influencer who's telling you what lipstick to put on or how to, put a new hair on. That's your choice. Maybe you should reflect on that choice.
You ever watch those 90 Day Fiance programs? They're pretty good. Um,
Probably are. I don't want to say too, but is it Beyonce?
no, it's
Fiance.
it's like a TLC.
Oh, TLC, 90
Yeah.
Days.
Fiance. Yeah.
No, I haven't seen, but I've, the Bachelorette and the Bachelor.
It's a train wreck.
Okay, I won't watch it, but it's okay. Entertainment is okay, but there's a line when it's like you've gone to the other side because all you're doing is entertaining yourself and distracting yourself online, and you've wasted this incredible opportunity of all that information is out there, tons, and you could be reading about this and that. And
Lon, you say that people are more educated now, or that there's more channels to educate yourself widely, but aren't people also a great deal more misinformed now?
I'm gonna let them in. I'm curious to see what they say.
So I'd like to add on to the idea of being solely responsible for yourself. And being responsible for yourself and governing your own actions was a key part of Indigenous law practices. We actually believe from a very young age that everyone is responsible for their own choices. We never even gave each other advice, as in, I think you should do this. You were given a story and then you went off and you thought about it, and the decision you made was the decision you acted on. And that was your fault. And your failure or success was your own. So from a very young age, from the time you could walk, everything you did was your responsibility. And whether you failed or you didn't, that was on you. But your family was always there to support you. You were always
Yes.
there to watch and
Yeah.
learn. And when you made a mistake, we had justice systems that involved community reciprocity and making sure that you could make up for that in a way that you continue being in your community, you continue growing as a human being. But I also think it's really important that we understand that entertainment and being together and being friends was a really important part
Yeah,
of Indigenous
yeah,
society. We
sure,
dance
sure.
because we feel it's spiritual, because it feels good. We sing because it feels good. We tell stories because our history is important and it informs our decisions. And part of being balanced in an Indigenous worldview is enjoying your life, especially with your family and friends. Sometimes being with your friends and having everyone over for dinner is a radical act. Sometimes just checking on people is a radical act. Sometimes just going out of your way to talk to someone when they look upset is a radical act. And I would invite you all to just be really good friends to each other, even as an Indigenous teaching. Just make sure that you're integrating yourself into your community. If you feel isolated, you don't have to. And it just takes a little bit of something in here that feels very counteractive to everything you've ever learned in your entire life. Just put yourself out there and make some friends and some community, because it's out there and we all want community. We all want a connection. And even if you feel really isolated, like you've been born alone and you're going to die alone, you don't have to. And that may be your responsibility to fix, but it is something that you can absolutely fix.
Thank you, Brooke, for all of that.
And just for
Right.
the record, you are part of the Durham College community, kind of whether you like it or not. So yeah, come join us. We're your community. Come have soup.
It's beautiful. Well, maybe we should start concluding. I mean, I always like to end on a high note, but there probably are more high notes. But I feel like we've climbed to the top of the mountain, or we're looking out now, and soup. You can't get much more real than that. But hold on, we have still 10 minutes officially. Okay, you were here only scheduled till 11:30. Are you okay to stay a little, like till 5 more minutes?
I don't have another meeting till 3.
Okay, so you can stay till 3? No, that's 5 more minutes. Okay. Let's see what's happening in the cosmos. I don't know. We haven't been on YouTube. I had to cut that, but we are here. Nothing in the chat. So, okay, maybe we should start to conclude. And first, what time is the soup available?
It's been on the stove all morning, so if you want chicken noodle soup, come next door.
So I'm going to say, for those of you in the cosmos and those of you watching the recording later, look at what you missed. I know you're busy, but you missed soup. So I'd like to give Rachel and Brooke and the First Peoples Indigenous Center a great hand for what they've done, and the whole idea of reciprocity, which is an important word. It's basically give and take. we have a history of that in Canada to some extent. We called it bilateral free trade more currently, but give and take. So, is there anything you'd like to say as a final word to everyone? So there's the in-person group, there's the ones online, and then there's about 60 others that watch the recordings. So I'll let you two have the final word.
I mean, I was gonna say hi to my former professor, but I guess YouTube's down, so I can't because that's where she was watching it. But if she accesses the recording, hi,
Yes.
Katrina.
Good. Okay, Brooke, anything? I think you said it very well, but you're welcome if there's something you feel you want to just add.
Just make sure you make some friends and you're talking to people. Just don't make yourself an island.
Thank you. Okay, everybody, have a great bowl of soup if that's where you're going. I will see you here next week. Do not forget, if you want that mark, put your name up on the board here, okay? If you haven't, just write it there now, and I'll record it later, okay? On board. And yeah, here you go, comment cards, and I'll bring them to you, okay? Or you can do that. Why don't you do this now, just while Rachel and it's like old classes I used to do or hand out. Let's these are comment cards, so for the circle, and then write down anything. Okay, did you get your comment cards? Okay, yeah, good. Okay, comment cards. Just leave your card, or you can hand it to Rachel and Brooke. I don't know. I'll get them to you, but they're going to do them now. So do the card now. It's best. Write your comments now, and then we can give them to Rachel and Brooke as they leave. Everybody online, we are going to conclude. Is there anything you'd like us to know? Please put it into the live chat right now. Otherwise, I'm going to end the class, okay? Great. And I'll save. I don't think we need to. Here, I'll save the live chat. Oopsie daisy. I'm going to stop the recording. Okay, have a good day. Yep, there's a live chat. See you. Take care, Isabel. Have a good week. Okay, enjoy the soup from the Cosmos in the live chat. Good, Akmal. All right, and the pen's over there. Yeah, just wait for it there, okay? Just sign your name anywhere. I'll be saving that. Don't worry. I'm going to stop the recording, and then that's a critical thing.